Hi and welcome. My name is Adam Ruege. I'm the Director of Strategy and Evaluation for Built for Zero at Community Solutions. We're very excited to have you all join us to talk about youth homelessness. A little bit about Built for Zero. Built for Zero is a national movement of over 140 communities in the United States and over 75 communities internationally that we work with to adopt a data-driven solutions-focused model. If you're interested in learning more about Built for Zero, if you're not currently know much about it, I encourage you to take a look at our website at www.community.solutions. But today, our focus is on youth homelessness. We have partnered with our learning and evaluation partner, ORS Impact, to understand progress made around youth homelessness, interventions that are working or supports that are working, and then identify opportunities for improvement. The research that they've conducted over the last 18 months that has included literature review, deep literature reviews, conversations with sector partners, conversations with communities, and people with lived experience has provided some really good insights into existing approaches and offers recommendations for improving services and scaling solutions in this area. I would be remiss to say a special thank you to the funders for this work that has included the Rakes Foundation, the Schultz Family Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Hilton Foundation, who have all supported the development of this report and the resources that accompany it. So now I'd like to introduce Scott Campanario, who will walk us through the key findings from the report. Scott.
Thanks, Adam. Well, it's great to be here. Really excited to have this session today to talk through what I think are some pretty meaningful and powerful findings from a recent project that we completed earlier this year with Community Solutions. Like Adam said, my name's Scott Campanario. I'm a senior research consultant with ORS Impact. We are a strategy and evaluation consulting firm based outside of the Seattle area. And currently, we are working as the learning and evaluation partner for the Built for Zero initiative as a part of a 5-year evaluation project with Community Solutions. And this work is actually kind of an offshoot of that project where we did a current state assessment of the landscape of youth homelessness approaches. And that's what we really want to talk through today. So I figured it would be good to start with just a little bit of context and framing. So we'll go ahead and, I'll kick us off with some framing around what this project was all about, why we were doing this work, and what our methodology was. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time really talking through findings around 6 key areas of inquiry. And we'll close off with a little bit of open discussion and Q&A. So with that, I thought it might be nice if we just start with a little bit of grounding around what the purpose of this project was. So we started this work with Community Solutions about 1.5 years ago, and the purpose of this project really was to help Community Solutions understand what's working and what's not working in preventing and ending youth homelessness across the country. So we engaged in a current state assessment and landscape scan really around all of the existing evidence, so peer-reviewed research, academic literature, field-leading approaches and frameworks, best practices that are surfacing from communities, and the experiences and wisdom of youth with lived experience of homelessness, really to identify what we can say about what's working well and where there are opportunities for improvement across youth homelessness strategies as a way to lift that up for both Community Solutions, but also the entire youth homelessness response sector. So that was kind of the focus of this project. And to do that, we wanted to focus on 6 key areas of inquiry. So the first is, how is the concept of youth homelessness defined in the field? Not just in terms of the technical definitions on paper, but what that actually means and what the implications of that are for youth seeking services and who can access which types of services. Then once youth are accessing those services, kind of our second area of inquiry here is what services, what approaches, what strategies have proven to be effective for reducing, ending, and preventing youth homelessness. Zooming out at more of a kind of a system level, we also have a question here around what's the role of coordination and collaboration across partners and providers in the youth homeless response system. We have another question here around what can we say about the unique experiences of different subpopulations of youth? So that would be different differences by race, sexual orientation, age range, geography, and a few other things. And then our last two areas of inquiry here are really around what this all means, right? So our one area of implications is what can we learn from work with youth populations that might have implications for our efforts with adult populations. And then the last box here is really what are the implications we would want to lift up for the field? What needs to be evolved or transformed or shifted across the entire youth homeless response field? So that's what we want to talk about today, is what we learned from this process, looking at these 6 areas of inquiry. And just briefly before we jump in, how we got this information, our methodology was really to look at data from 4 sources. And the first 3 of those 4 are really a landscape scan approach to review documentation and materials. So we looked at all of the academic literature, peer-reviewed literature, research, evaluations, frameworks, and theories dating back to the last 15 years. Any research on youth homelessness that was published in the last 15 years. We also looked at non-peer-reviewed applied materials. So this would be things like field building materials and frameworks, briefs, reports, perspective papers, opinion papers. And then we also reviewed a selection of strategy materials from a few different communities working with community solutions. Our 4th data source, and by and large our largest data source, is direct qualitative data through structured interviews with, I think we had a sample of 33 respondents to our data collection effort. And those respondents represented a pretty broad variety of voices in the field. We spoke with community leaders, we spoke with youth with lived experience, we spoke with representatives from state agencies, intermediaries, adjacent sectors, direct service providers. So we had a pretty diverse body of voices for this work. And from these 4 data sources, we generated a set of findings that are published in our report, which I would encourage anyone here to take a look at and to read. And we want to lift up a few of the what I think the kind of takeaways are from that report here today. So before I jump into that, Adam, anything else you would say about kind of our approach and methodology and the purpose or motivation behind some of this work?
Oh, I think the one thing that we learned early on is that even though this report was done to help inform us at Community Solutions Built for Zero, the strategy in developing support to communities around youth homelessness, we identified pretty early on that this sort of work would be valuable for the sector as a whole. And so that's, the big part of why, and with the support of our funders, we've published this report. We also just want to name something here, is that it's always evolving and always changing. And I think there's going to be elements in here in this report as Scott goes through them that will be evergreen. And there's going to be elements that might change. It's just the nature of the work that we're doing. So I just want to name that. And I think the key here too is that all of this was gathered really centering those who are experiencing trauma, the trauma homelessness. And really the report was designed to center those people. So just want to name that. And Scott, I think otherwise you covered it pretty well.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. All right, well, let's jump in. So starting with our first area of inquiry, want to share a couple of findings from our report. The kind of punchline from all of it is definitions matter. When we think about youth homelessness definitions, it's much more than just the technical definition on paper. There are very real implications of what definition is most commonly used in a community, both for the community itself and its response system, and then also for the clients who are navigating that system, trying to access services. So what we found is that currently there are 2 definitions of youth homelessness that are most widely used. The first comes from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, so HUD, and the second comes from the U.S. Department of Education's McKinney-Vento Act. But those 2 definitions have different criteria for who is considered homelessness. Specifically, the HUD definition places a much greater emphasis on literal homelessness. So individuals who are sleeping or residing in places that are not designed or not intended for human habitation. The U.S. Department of Education McKinney-Vento Act has a slightly broader set of criteria. It includes that emphasis on literal homelessness, but also includes youth who might be sleeping on a couch with friends, might be doubled up in a living situation where they technically have a roof over their head, but nonetheless do not have stable housing. So that's kind of, there's some subtle other nuances and differences between the two definitions, but that emphasis on kind of the parameters of who's included is really the key distinguishing factor between those definitions. And what we see is that regardless of what definition is in use, the lack of a single definition that's nationally recognized, agreed upon, and inclusive really creates a lot of challenges for communities. For example, having those two different definitions leads to conflicting prevalence statistics. So if you're using a definition that's more narrow, you probably have on paper, you have a smaller number of homeless youth in your community. Using a broader definition obviously includes more people. So you have these different prevalence statistics, and the ripple effect from that is pretty profound, right? There's misinformation in public narratives, differences in public perceptions around the magnitude of the situation, and that obviously has implications for a community's ability to secure funding based on the urgency of their situation or the magnitude of their situation. So these two definitions serve different purposes, but they also create these interesting challenges for a community to navigate. Within that, there are also some challenges for the clients themselves. Obviously, because the HUD definition focuses more on literal homelessness, so sleeping in a place that's not designed for human habitation, that does mean that there are a lot of young people who don't meet that criteria and therefore have limited access to services. And one of the interesting things that we heard in our interviews is that sometimes that actually creates a little bit of a perverse incentive for youth to hoop jump to get around red tape or restrictions. Just to share one anecdote, in one of our interviews, we heard a story about someone who was encouraged by a case manager to check into a shelter for one night so that they would at least be in the system, but then they could go back to what they were couch surfing. So essentially staying with friends, sleeping on a couch with a roof over their head, but they were encouraged to check into a shelter for one day so that they were in the system, right? And this is just one anecdote, one example, but I think it creates it's a good example and a good story of having that focus on literal homelessness does mean that sometimes youth have an incentive to go through this hoop jumping process to get access to services that require them to be literally homeless. And obviously that delays the service a little bit for them. And I think more importantly, it risks re-traumatizing those young people in their journey toward stable housing. Of course, there are also perspectives that would say that there is a very strong case for a more narrow and focused definition on literal homelessness, specifically in communities where there is a large number of homeless youth currently in need of services. In those situations, you have to have some way to prioritize. And if you shift from using the HUD definition to the McKinney-Vento Act definition, which is more inclusive, you're obviously going to have a larger number of youth pursuing services through your system. And oftentimes communities don't have the capacity to jump to that larger number, right? So it's a really interesting challenge having these two definitions because there are challenges that surface on either side of that, whichever definition you're using. But having the two definitions in and of themselves create all these interesting ripple effects for communities in terms of understanding who is homeless and who needs services, and how a community responds to that. So let me pause there. Adam, anything you would add or questions on your mind about this topic?
I think one of the questions that I have, and it's interesting that you lead with definitions, and what's the driver for why leading with this, on the outset? I know it's in the report and also leading with the definition here. I think the story that we hear from communities is that the multiple definitions does create a lot of confusion, and it creates challenges where certain definitions have funding, others don't. But why are you leading with it as in the report and here? Did it just come up a lot in your conversations with communities?
That's a great question. So it did come up a lot because in our interviews, as we started talking about youth homelessness, it kind of begs the question of, are we including folks who are couch surfing or doubling up? And we have to clarify that before we continued the interview. So it did come up organically in that sense. But conceptually, I think the reason why it's important to start with definitions is that understanding how to respond to youth homelessness really requires you to understand what you're addressing. And different services might be more or less appropriate or more or less effective for youth in different situations, right? Someone who is truly unsheltered, living in a space that's not designed for human habitation requires a unique approach that might be different from someone who has some of the other things figured out. Maybe they do have temporarily a roof over their head, but they need a different type of service or a different suite of services. So understanding what we're talking about, I think, is kind of a prerequisite to then talk about what works well for addressing it.
Great. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move us forward to our second area of inquiry here. So once we kind of understand what it is we're talking about, our second area of inquiry is really around what works well. What interventions work more or less effectively for youth entering the homeless response system. And there's a lot in the report. I would encourage anyone here to please go take a look at that report. There's a lot that we talk about for what works well for different outcomes in different settings. But what I want to offer here, because there's so much content to talk about in terms of youth homelessness strategies and interventions, I want to focus here on kind of giving the menu of options, right? Think of this as the list of themes that came up in our research and our interviews that I think either show strong findings for their effectiveness, or they show early promising findings, and they're an area that is continuing to grow in this space. So a couple of things. One of the things that we heard in our interviews is that the idea of a coordinated entry system, so a system where youth can enter at various access points, and as they pursue those services and those access points, their data is tracked in a data infrastructure. It's shared between partners so that those partners and providers can actually case conference and identify who's delayed in service, who's accessing services, and really tracking clients across the system. Having that coordinated entry system is, by and large, it's a ticket to play. You have to have that to really be able to understand the system that youth are navigating, the systems of care. And that's not dissimilar from what we know of adult populations. Having that coordinated entry system is incredibly important. But I think some of the things that stood out in our interviews specifically about youth is that those coordinated entry systems often use a prioritization process so that they can understand the level of urgency and need for each client coming through the door. But that process for youth really needs to be informed by youth with lived experience. So there's this kind of call from youth with lived experience and community leaders and providers to rethink their prioritization process to better reflect the actual experiences that youth go through. Other things that we heard is that coordinated entry system needs to align well, going back to the definitions question, it needs to align well with the definitions that are being used by providers. So if a provider is using the HUD definition, that needs to be aligned well with how the coordinated entry system understands and prioritizes which youth can access which services. And then maybe apparently, but maybe not, the idea that this system needs to allow for data sharing is incredibly important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. But just having a system where someone can go to a specific service and have their data entered into the system, and then that data is shared between partners who are leading this work across a community is really important. Another, what I would consider kind of a ticket to play, is case management. When we did our interviews with youth with lived experience, that was one of the most clear recurring themes from these conversations, that having a case manager is an essential factor for helping someone navigate the system and find stable housing. But it's more than just having case management. What we heard from youth is that they really, the cases and situations that have worked the best are when they have a case manager who is authentic and genuine and showing their care, their interest in that young person. They take the time to build trust, to build vulnerability, to create a psychologically safe space. And this last one, which I think is really important, is the idea of consistency. So we all know that turnover is a pervasive problem in this sector. But for youth, what they shared is that when they have a case manager who leaves and they're connected to a new case manager, that really does hurt their ability to build momentum in terms of trust and personalized care. They kind of feel like they're starting from ground zero with a new case manager. So having that consistency, finding ways to retain case managers and to keep a consistent relationship between the individual client and the case manager is another really important intervention in this space. Two other things that I think are these are more on the early side of entering the system. We heard a lot in our interviews about broader prevention strategies. And one of those strategies would be a diversion approach. And what we heard is that this idea of diversion is essentially a way to divert youth from entering the system at the door by empowering them in influencing decisions and having a voice in the conversation early on about what they need. Do they need to enter the system? What other options are available to them, essentially as a way to prevent their engagement into the system, or their entering into the system. But what's interesting about diversion programs is that we heard it's on one hand, yes, it is kind of a targeted intervention, but it's also a set of principles which I think are really interesting. They're principles of empowerment, principles of equipping people with the capability. So a lot of the things within a diversion program will offer flexible funding for providers, funding for operational capacity, funding for capacity building through training or upskilling. So it's this targeted intervention to divert youth at the door while also embedding these principles of empowerment and flexible funding for capacity. Another prevention approach that we heard about are cash transfer programs, which I think are really interesting. Surprisingly, there's slightly less research on these cash transfer programs than some of the other interventions that we looked at. But a cash transfer program is essentially a program that provides direct financial assistance for a young person to use in however they see fit. And what we've seen is that there are some early research suggesting that these cash transfer programs are actually pretty effective for reducing poverty and the duration of homelessness for an individual client. What I think is interesting is that it's also pretty common for people to raise concerns that these cash transfer funds are going to be used, or I guess misused, for what researchers call temptation goods, which is essentially non-essential and potentially harmful goods that are not going to help someone achieve housing stability. Most commonly, people will talk about misusing funds for drugs or alcohol. But what the research is suggesting is that quite the opposite. Not only do these programs help reduce poverty and the duration of homelessness, they actually have kind of an unintended consequence of reducing illicit activity because they take away the financial pressures to get involved in some illicit activity around selling drugs and transactions related to drugs. So there's this interesting set of findings that I think are really promising for cash transfer programs, not only for reaching the intended outcomes, but also preventing some of the unintended harmful outcomes. So, these four are really kind of the early stages of the system, kind of at the door and preventing youth homelessness. Once, obviously that's not going to always work. There will be youth in the system. So once a young person is in the system, what we heard really is that housing solutions is obviously a huge strategy across the sector, but that it's really a couple of things. It's that one is that housing first can't be housing only. So ensuring that the housing solutions that we're leveraging for young people, that those provide the wraparound supports. And those wraparound supports can be things like drop-in centers, transportation services, counseling programs, employment programs, like all of those wraparound services are incredibly important beyond just doing the kind of housing solution. But the housing solutions themselves are also, just as important. And in terms of the housing solutions, we in our report, we talk a lot about how there's a wide variety, everything from emergency shelters to temporary housing solutions to permanent supportive housing. And, I think what we heard in our interviews with community leaders and with youth themselves is that the housing solution has to match the needs of the individual. And that's something that should be built into the coordinated entry system and the conversations that communities are having with young people as they enter the system. Outside of that, though, there's also this need for increasing the housing supply altogether, right? And this is something that we've heard, for a very long time in this space, that there is a shortage of beds for young people and for adult populations. But in our interviews, communities are innovating in this space. They're trying to find ways to engage landlords, to engage property owners, to acquire funding or through policy advocacy work to advocate for new buildings for young people, right? So there's work happening here, but it's really, once a young person is in the system, it's a suite of things that they need. Obviously, it's the housing. Obviously, it's a increased housing supply so that they can acquire housing, and then it's the wraparound services, right? The drop-in centers, the assistance with transportation, counseling, and treatment to not just help youth recover from kind of clinical trauma, but also to proactively plan and set goals for their future, and then building those employment skills. To kind of work towards stability going forward. So I know that's a lot. Again, there's much more in the report, but hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the things that came up in our research around common interventions and what's working well. So let me pause there. Adam, any thoughts you want to add here or questions?
Yes. Scott, I appreciate that overview. And as you mentioned, there's a lot more detail in the report, and it's really just scratching the surface on all the initiatives and all the efforts across the nation around youth homelessness. But I think it really does capture kind of the buckets really well. One of the quotes that's actually in the report that just was really compelling to me, and it actually touches on a number of these things you mentioned, was towards the end of the report, I think page 30. In their own words, of a youth with lived experience, or was maybe even experiencing homelessness at the time, encourage all adults to open up their minds and get out of their childhood and step into ours. I think it was such a compelling quote because it's a reminder that, we were youth once, but our experiences were much different. And we have to make sure, if we're case managers, clinicians, if we're program managers, if we're policymakers, that we have to center the experience of their clients, right? Of the youth. I think that was just a compelling statement and a compelling quote that, was gathered from the interviews. And like that, and I think this needs to be true across all populations, regardless of what population of people experiencing homelessness is working with. We need to be centering the client, but it really did come out quite a bit in this report in itself, whether it be, empowering, youth through direct cash transfers, or having case managers that are, that are sticking with their clients, or, what other programs, maybe job programs or whatever it may be, really that is really guided by the client. So it's not really a question, Scott, just like highlighting that was one of the key pieces, I think, from this report that really affected me and a lot of the others that read this, is around that need to really make sure that when we're providing, if you're a clinician or a manager or an executive director, that you're really centering the people that need the support.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, Adam, because it is incredibly important, and it is a mindset shift that youth are calling the field to embrace. And so one of the later slides, I'm actually going to come back to the finding that's tied to that exact quote around kind of putting yourself in the shoes of youth going through the system. That's a really important implication to lift up for the field. So I'm glad you mentioned it. Okay, well, I will keep us going here. Advance forward here to our next section, which is, if you think about the last two sections, are a little more focused on how providers think about youth homelessness and what services they're offering. If we zoom out a little bit to the system level, another area of our report that we explore is this idea of coordination and collaboration. So we know this is true of adult populations, that collaborative and coordinated efforts across providers and across partners is really important. And probably not surprisingly, the same findings surfaced when we did this work related to youth homelessness. But there are a couple of things about it that I think are maybe more emphasized or more pronounced here, or slightly unique for the youth space. So just, at the surface kind of foundational level, we know that coordination and collaboration between adjacent systems of care is really important for youth for a couple of reasons. One is that it allows partners and providers to have a good pulse on what's happening in their system. They're talking with each other, they're sharing data with each other, so they have a good sense of where youth are in the system and who's accessing what services, where there might be barriers, where there might be disproportionality in outcomes. It really gives them that kind of line of sight into monitoring their system. But in addition to that, it's also a really potent strategy for prevention, because as these systems of care are collaborating and coordinating together, they're monitoring where there might be potential exits from one system of care directly into homelessness. So that coordination is important both for monitoring the current situation, but also for preventing future homelessness. But what we heard when we talked with community leaders and some of the adjacent system representatives in our interviews is that all of that requires a pretty substantial shift in mindset toward one of shared responsibility or shared accountability for youth after they exit your system of care, which I think is a pretty important reflection about what it means to really coordinate with that shared sense of responsibility. If you think about, like, if you're an educator working with youth, right? Oftentimes you think about it as once that young person graduates from whatever schooling they're in, it's often that they move on to the next thing, right? And they kind of leave your mind. And what we heard is that from adjacent system leaders and community leaders is that if we can shift that toward we are responsible for their well-being and their stability even after they leave our institution or leave our system of care, that's a really powerful way to start to work toward prevention. And when you make that mindset shift, then the case for coordinating and collaborating with adjacent systems, wherever those youth may go, becomes really strong. So, that's one of kind of the key takeaways, right? Coordination and collaboration is really important. In terms of who is collaborating and coordinating within the youth space, what we heard most frequently is foster care, education, and juvenile justice are some of the most commonly engaged systems of care. But there are a lot of communities who are also exploring work with non-traditional partners, things like Planned Parenthood or job centers. And I think that's a really interesting way to approach this, is kind of backwards mapping out, where are youth actively engaged in a community? What are the institutions and organizations and systems that they are most frequently using? And then engaging those systems in the community's response to youth homelessness. So it's kind of like coordination is really important. Lots of people can and should play a role, but you have to get creative and think about really where are youth active in your community, and then going and engaging those systems and institutions and organizations. Of course, that all sounds great on paper, but we also heard it is very difficult for a lot of reasons. One is around kind of the data sharing logistics, especially for things like healthcare and education. There are data standards and restrictions and compliance standards that these organizations have to maintain. And so sometimes that creates a little bit of skepticism or concern around sharing data between partners and coordinating with partners on kind of a by name basis. But communities have found ways to work around that. It's just, it really is a process of building trust and ensuring the safeguards are there for safe and secure data. We also heard that a challenge is poor accountability mechanisms. So it's kind of like, it's great if you're sharing data, but if no one feels accountable to the data, sharing the data is insufficient in that context, right? So there are lots of challenges. I think kind of across those challenges, continuing to build high quality relationships, trust, and formal structural partnerships with other systems of care really is the takeaway for communities. In that last point about formal structural partnerships, one of the things that was really apparent in our interviews is that the reason that is so important is that oftentimes in this sector, people over-index on personal one-to-one relationships, which of course those are helpful, right? It's always going to be helpful if you have a trusting relationship, a personal relationship with someone in an adjacent system or an adjacent institution or organization. That's going to be helpful for how you work with that person. But the challenge is when that person leaves, and again, we know turnover is pretty rampant in this sector. When that person leaves, if the only connection point you had with that system of care is through that personal relationship, then there's a resulting loss in knowledge, a loss in resource sharing and information flows, right? So this kind of the challenge is personal one-to-one relationships are great, but they really need to be formal structural partnerships to make sure that they are resilient to, the changing tides of the talent market in the sector. So a lot of important things here around coordination and collaboration, and the challenges that come with it. I'll pause here. Adam, any thoughts on your
Scott,
mind?
yeah, appreciate you lifting this up. And I think, when we think about the communities that we work with in Community Solutions and Built for Zero, those communities that have what we think of have more people at the table, right? Especially, and we see this very clearly in the youth space. The most successful communities in preventing and reducing, youth homelessness are those that are going to non-traditional partners, are going to the local faith-based community, are going to, the school. They're embedded in the school systems, and you could go on and on. And while, this is a real challenge for many communities because of the resource, communities are oftentimes not resourced enough to be able to do that type of work. What we've seen time and time again is those communities that do that are able to, maybe they get resources from other places outside the federal government, for example, are much there. It's a lot easier for them to really divert homelessness in the first place. And it all comes down to that coordination piece. The other thing I think that we've learned here is around the coordination is that that so much of it is about relationship building. It's not prohibited, right? We hear this often about data sharing is not prohibited or this thing's not allowed. Well, what we've learned time and time again is that in fact they are, and it's more about the resources and political will. And when communities can really dedicate time to focus on that coordination, they see the outcomes that follow along. So, again, I'm just excited to see this being lifted up and really highlighted. This should exist in all elements of the system, and especially in the youth system.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, and that push for engaging those non-traditional partners, I think, is a very optimistic note. I mean, we heard a lot about the challenges, but thinking expansively and innovatively about the non-traditional partners who come to mind, I think is for me at least a very optimistic takeaway.
Yeah, and we heard stories about youth, with lived experience trying to engage other youth, going to the skate park, right? Going to those places where folks or youth are hanging out, and really thinking outside the paradigm of traditional outreach that exists in the adult system, but really getting creative to engage youth where they're at.
Absolutely. All right, just keeping an eye on the clock here. I think I'll move us forward to our last kind of core finding, and then we'll close out with a couple of sections on implications to lift up. But our fourth kind of area of inquiry here was really around what do we know about the unique experiences of different subpopulations of youth that might require a more tailored and focused approach when we think of services and interventions. And in our interviews, we left this kind of open-ended to see what subpopulations our community is really thinking about and focusing on. And there are four here that I want to call out. There's additional commentary in the report on this, but four that I want to call out here are LGBTQIA plus youth, BIPOC and Indigenous youth, pregnant and parenting youth, and then youth at different age ranges. So starting with LGBTQIA plus youth, I think one of the interesting things that we heard in our interviews is that these young people are they're actually dissuaded or fearful from pursuing services out of a fear of their own safety, specifically in shelter environments. We heard this in a number of our interviews with community leaders and with some of the youth with lived experience, that a lot of these young people, even though they have access to a shelter, they know that a shelter is what they need. It is the next thing that they need in their journey toward a stable housing solution. They still feel pressured and dissuaded from pursuing that shelter because in their experiences, those shelters have not been safe and secure spaces for LGBTQIA plus youth. And from the community leader perspective, what we heard is that this really highlights the need for trauma-informed training and culturally competent staff at these shelters and various housing solutions to really be able to respond and ensure the safety and security of LGBTQIA plus youth. So that focus on safe and encouraging and trauma-informed environments is a really important takeaway for services for LGBTQIA plus youth. For BIPOC and Indigenous youth, we heard a lot of similar kind of takeaways around the need for trauma-informed and culturally competent resources and training for staff at these different providers. But one of the things that we heard from community leaders is that, what makes the situation for BIPOC youth particularly unique is that we have historically had disproportionate rates of homelessness, discrimination, and violence-based trauma for this group. And despite us knowing that there are these disproportionate rates, we have not seen the change and progress over long periods of time, despite knowing that it exists. And so it's almost like I think one of the community leaders, we talked a little bit about, we can say that we need more trauma-informed care and culturally competent services, but we really need commitment from leadership in communities to operationalize what that means and to make it real in the services and housing solutions that are offered for these youth. Because the call for trauma-informed care and culturally competent service, obviously that's important, but so far it has yet to actually operationalize in a reduction of that disproportionality in outcomes. We also talked a little bit about pregnant and parenting youth. And I think one of the interesting takeaways when we think of this subpopulation of youth is that their needs are so unique from most youth entering the youth homelessness system, but there are not a lot of services that specifically provide them with the resources they need. So, when we had these conversations, we heard a little bit about the need for childcare, the need for community support groups, the basic needs of like formula, diapers. We heard clearly the need for safer housing solutions than what you might expect in a typical emergency shelter. And so some communities, there's I think some optimism here. Some communities are experimenting with different ways to prioritize pregnant and parenting youth within a coordinated entry system. They're experimenting with ways to provide these youth with a case manager that has lived experience in that space and can provide that specialized assistance. But by and large, we heard that there needs to be more for this specific subpopulation of youth, given their unique needs. And the last finding here I want to call out is it's really not a subpopulation, but rather a consideration that communities must be mindful of, which is that youth at different age ranges have different developmental needs and therefore probably require a different service approach when we think about helping them work through the system and finding a stable housing solution, which should be a part of that coordinated entry process as that young person enters the system. That's a part of the conversation, identifying what is needed for them given their developmental age range. But it's also a little bit of a mindset shift of the community to move away from these kind of off-the-shelf solutions, one solution fits all, in terms of age ranges, and instead thinking about what are the unique challenges and needs and priorities of this individual client and what service is most appropriate for them. And you could say that mindset shift probably cuts across all of these findings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and a few other mindset shifts and some of these next slides here. But anyway, these give you a sense of some of the subpopulations that came up in our conversations with community leaders and what might be needed for their unique needs. Adam, any thoughts you would add to this one?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, but I just want to come back to, and I know you get into this in the findings and implications of the importance of trauma-informed care, right? And that I think the thing that we learn working in these systems is that the biggest harm you can create is re-traumatizing people because of the system that's been built around them to help them. And so, like, really just continuing that thread, right? Whether you're looking at different subpopulations of youth experiencing homelessness or the population as a whole, you have to have trauma-informed care at front and center to make sure that re-traumatization is not happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, that's great foreshadowing for one of our upcoming slides, which is all about the shifts in mindsets that are needed to operationalize that. Okay, so let's move in that direction. We just have two kind of closing sections here around some of the implications of this work. One is the implications of efforts with youth populations for what could be done with adult populations. And this is a really interesting question because on one hand, the experiences of youth and young adults are so different from adults navigating the system. They have different needs, different experiences, different challenges, and different solution opportunities or service opportunities. So we can't ignore the fact that those experiences are so different. But on the other hand, there are some underlying basic principles, some foundational principles that apply for both youth and adult populations. So the things that we heard in our interviews that are working well with young adult or youth and young adult populations that I think they would lift up and say, these are things that need to be leveraged with adult populations. There are a couple that I want to call out. One, and this is probably not a surprise to anyone, but there is a common need for investment in the foundational capacity, whether that's through operational funding, flexible funding, capacity building, training and education or other upskilling, basic recruitment and hiring, retention strategies, all of those basic foundational capacity dimensions. That's something that in our interviews, that was clear across almost every single interview. That's an important piece of this, and that's probably equally true for adult populations. The reality is that this work requires investment for foundational capacity, whether that comes through federal funding, philanthropy, private partnerships, individual donations. There is that need, and so I think the takeaway there is investing in the fund development strategy of a community is really important. Having dedicated roles for that is really important for that foundational capacity. A second kind of underlying principle that I would lift up from our findings with youth populations is the focus on prevention, right? And the fact that prevention really does require a cross-sector or adjacent system approach that's kind of like with the targeted emphasis on collaboration, on structural partnerships, on identifying youth at risk of becoming homeless when exiting a certain system, of going through the transitional or prevention planning, right? So all of those things that we talked about for the coordination and collaboration and the focus on prevention, I think that's also true for adult populations, that it does take a coordinated effort to really emphasize prevention and divert homelessness before it happens. Another thing that I think was really clear in our interviews with youth homelessness services is this idea of empowerment, putting clients in the driver's seat. I think that's something that we haven't heard as much about in the adult population space, and I could be wrong on that, but I think it's important. It's an important takeaway from the youth space to really think about what does it mean to empower your clients, to have them be an influential voice in the decision-making process. And that goes beyond simple things like collecting feedback to improve programs or improve services. It's really empowering them to own to own with the support of the community their progress through the system toward a stable housing solution. And then the last thing I would say here is, the idea that coordinated entry really does require engagement from all of the different partners and providers. Again, that coordinated entry piece is such an important ticket to play, but it does require the community's engagement, and that community, meaning, all of the partners and providers who are within that coalition actively engaged, sharing their data, sharing information, working together to monitor that data. and having the accountability mechanisms in place to make sure that they are all accountable toward meeting their shared aims. There's obviously a ton that goes into that process. In our report, we talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but I think it's a really important takeaway for adult populations is having that active engagement from adjacent sectors. Okay, so before I move us to kind of our closing section, Adam, anything you would want to add here around the transferability of this work to adult populations?
Yeah, I think these are all great examples, and I know there's work being done on each of them for the adult population, different levels. I do just want to say though, for number 3 especially, and some of the communities that are in Built for Zero that we've worked with that have really empowered youth advisory boards. Those are compelling. They really support when they're really given power. They do support the redesign of these systems to be more client or customer focused, and they get outcomes. And I think there's a lot that we can learn. I appreciate y'all adding this as part of your report, because I think in the adult sector there's a lot we can learn from this, because it's absolutely translatable and transferable to the adult sector. It's just that there's been a lot of effort over the last few years to develop these types of boards or empowering youth. I think we have a long way to go. I'm not going to say that by any means are these systems perfect, but I think when we look at the youth advisory boards, especially, that there's so much progress being made there, and that the adult system could actually learn quite a bit from the youth system and how they've empowered those boards and those individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, with our last little bit of time here, I want to close us out with some of the things we heard from our interviews and our landscape scanning work around broader implications for the field. I mean, the reality is we did these 33 interviews, and we looked at all this research, and there's so much great, rich information that just didn't fit within our other 5 kind of areas of inquiry. And that's where we have this wealth of wisdom from young people with lived experience, from community leaders, from adjacent system leaders and state agencies. And so I want to lift up some of the things that were clear from that wisdom as kind of implications for the field. These are kind of like calls to action for the field. So the first one is, and we've talked a little bit about this, but communities really do need to consider the shift from general to tailored supports. I think this came up in some of our interviews with community leaders, specifically around the push to find solutions that are scalable often comes with a price tag of those solutions being very generalized and a little bit lacking in taking into account the unique experiences of each individual client, which is one of the things that, on one hand does make them very scalable. But what we heard from the community leaders and youth with lived experiences is that because youth face challenges across multiple domains of life with unique experiences and unique circumstances, these one-size-fits-all approaches are often insufficient. So underlying that is a need for a mindset shift away from general one-size-fits-all off-the-shelf solutions to really putting the client at the center. And focusing on what that client's needs are, what their experiences are, what their challenges are, and working within that space to identify what's a tailored and individualized support. Similar to that, this is kind of the point that Adam brought up earlier. We heard about this shift for providers to step out of their youth and step into the youth of their clients. And I really love the quote, Adam, that you mentioned earlier. We heard across almost all of our interviews, both with youth with lived experience and community leaders, that there is this pervasive sense of adultism across this sector, where oftentimes youth feel like they are shut out or shut down, their perspectives, because of their age range. There's a sense of, because I am the adult, I know best. And youth really expressed how damaging that can be as they're working through these conversations of what supports they need. So to combat that, I think the call that we heard, the call to action, is to really focus on building trust with your clients, leveraging their strengths, and empowering them, and not in a superficial, just putting words to paper kind of way, but in a very genuine, authentic sense of putting them in the driver's seat, allowing them to express what they think is the solution they need, and then working with them, building respect or building trust and showing respect as you have those conversations. That's a pretty important shift. Another thing we heard is that, I think right now in the field, the idea of lived experience is obviously such an important concept, but there are some considerations that need to be brought up with that. One is that, actively engaging youth for, in decision making and in strategic conversations is obviously important, but youth discussed how there needs to be some consideration to how you do that without re-traumatizing the individuals. And part of that means empowering youth in decision making in a way that respects how they want to engage. So for some youth, they might not want to engage in the way that you have planned out, and really valuing that and respecting that and accepting it is an important way to actively engage youth with lived experience, but give consideration to how you can avoid re-traumatizing them in that process. The other thing we heard in that context is how important it is to close the loop. So when you engage youth with lived experience and you take their feedback and their input, and then you make changes or you make adjustments, it goes a long way to build the trust with your community. If you close the loop back with them, you share back, here's what we heard, here's what we did, and here's our gratitude for your contributions to this process. That goes a long way for building trust and respect within your community. A similar sentiment came up in terms of staff with lived experience. We heard from youth that they really value seeing staff with lived experience in the services that they're pursuing, but the same consideration needs to be given there, right? Engaging staff in a way that does not re-traumatize and that really does offer the genuine support and care of your staff. So we know that, having staff with lived experience does a lot for building trust with youth, giving space for more empathetic relationships, but there needs to be that commitment to valuing the well-being of staff, valuing their expertise, and involving them in meaningful conversations. A few other things we heard in terms of implications from the field. We've talked a little bit about these, but there's a very clear need for cultural competency and trauma-informed care. We know, just given the unique circumstances of youth and their context and experiences, that these are incredibly important and that there is a lot more that can be done to embed cultural competency and trauma-informed care into the services that are offered. Similarly, we also heard a call for more innovation. So this is kind of a space where a lot of communities express that not much has changed in terms of the methods and approaches that have been used in the last decade. And so this call for new thinking, novel thinking, innovative thinking is a really important one. Some communities talked about how they are trying to explore what would outreach look like if you leverage social media or TikTok or radio, right? So moving beyond the current best practices to think about what could be an innovative way to improve service connection, to improve accessibility for youth. That's another kind of call to the field. And the last one I would say here is that, communities lifted up that funders play a absolutely critical role in advancing this field toward a collective response. So it's more than just offering the funding, which of course is important, but it's also finding ways to promote coordination, making coordination and collaboration a part of the requirement for funding. It's finding ways to incentivize aligned and uniform strategies across partners in different systems of care. And then it's finding ways to embed continuous improvement and shared learning, right, through things like peer learning opportunities, network building, relationship building. All of those things, I think communities lifted up as important, but without the incentive to do those things, they sometimes get left by the wayside. So that's one role or one way that funders could play a role in advancing this field toward a more collective response. So I'll pause there. Adam, any closing thoughts on some of these implications for the field?
No, I think these are all spot on, right? And I think a lot of this is going to be just reinforcing what we already know as a sector. And so there's some new things in here that I think are going to be interesting. I do encourage you to take a look at the report. It is as Scott had mentioned, it goes into much more detail with the learnings from this research. You can access this report on our website at community.solutions. If you're still on the line, haven't accessed it, you can also read the report through the QR code on your screen. But given the time, I think we're going to wrap up. And Scott, again, thank you to you and your team and the ORS Impact team to pulling this together. We're very grateful for this. I think that this is going to be very useful across many of our departments and many of our organizations. If you have questions, don't feel free to reach out. We're always happy to engage in a discussion. And I think we'll wrap up. So, Scott, any last words from you?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to share some of these findings from this work, and appreciate the support of our funders and the leadership at Community Solutions. I think this was a really meaningful project just to get a download and a pulse of what's happening in the sector and the current state of things. So I appreciate this opportunity, and appreciate the opportunity to share what we learned with this group. So like Adam said, please reach out if you have any questions. I've included my email address here, so don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. Also, encourage everyone to take a look at the report. Use the QR code there on the screen, and yeah, thank you all so much for making time for this.
All right, thank you.